The sea doesn't mourn. It swallows, it churns, it moves on us. If grief were a foreign substance, it refuses to dissolve. That night off the Norwegian coast, in March '43, the North Atlantic wore its usual mask of ink and ice, but beneath it, U-boats coiled like eels in the deep, waiting. HMS Blackwood, a captain-class frigate lent to us by the Yanks, but crewed by Royal Navy souls, patrolled convoy JW-53's outer screen, her sonar pinging into the abyss like a blind man tapping a cane. I was in the wireless room, headphones clamped tight, ears tuned to the static-laced whispers from Scapa Flow and the distant crackle of Admiralty cipher traffic. My watch my father's Waltham brusquest, water-stained from Dunkirktit, against my wrist, like a second heartbeat. I didn't know then. It would soon carry too. The attack came just past 020. No warning. One moment, the sea was black glass. The next, a bloom of white fire split the starboard bow as a G7E torpedo struck amid. The shock threw me against the bulkhead, teeth rattling, ears ringing with a shriek of tearing steel alarm so lead. Men shouted in clipped, panicked syllables. Below decks, the engine room flooded with incessant seawater pouring through a rupture near the aft boiler. We were dead in the water, listing 10 degrees, smoke coiling from the bridge like a funeral shroud. Depth charges exploded in the distance, SOAR escorts retaliating, but the real threat was inside. A ruptured fuel line near the magazine, hissing like a serpent, primed to turn our frigate into a torch. Then came Evans, not petty officer, Evans. Ordinary seaman, barely 20, from Swansea, with hands too big for his frame and a laugh that sounded like gravel in a tin can. He'd joined us in Reykjavik, replacing a signalman lost to pneumonia. "Quiet lad," kept to himself, wrote letters every Sunday in neat copperplate, always sealed with a wax stamp shaped like a dove. He wasn't on duty that watch, but he appeared in the corridor outside the wireless room, oilsmeared and wide-eyed, as I fumbled for my emergency kit. "They're trying to reach the valve," he said, voice steady, despite the chaos. But the bulkheads buckled, only weigh-ins through the ventilation shaft. I knew what that meant. The shaft ran past the ruptured fuel line fumes thick enough to knock a man flat in 3 breaths, and if a spark jumped, Evans didn't wait for orders. He handed me his cap navy blue, slightly, Fredan said. "If I don't make it back, tell my mom I finished her scarf." Then he was gone, crawling into that metal throat like a man returning to the womb. 20 minutes later, the hissing stopped. They found his body wedged near the main fuel cutoff valve, one hand still gripping the wrench, the other clutching a half-finished letter in his pocket. He'd sealed the leak. Saved the ship. Saved us. But when the report went up the chain, something shifted. The torpedo strike had been mislogged, initially blamed on friendly depth-charge concussion, not a U, and Evans hadn't been officially assigned to damage control. Worse, his actions, though heroic, occurred outside command protocol, in the cold arithmetic of wartime bureaucracy that made him inconvenient. Inconvenient. By dawn, the order came down from Captain Rutherford himself, voiced low over the intercom. "Strike Evans from the action report. List him as missing, presumed lost during evacuation. No citation. No mention." I stood on the quarterdeck as the burial detail slid his canvas-wrapped body into the sea. No bugle. No prayer, just the groan of winches and the wind stealing his name before it could echo. The logbook entry that afternoon read, "1 rating lost overboard during emergency maneuvers. Identity unconfirmed." That night, in the dim glow of my hammock, I took my Waltham from my pocket. With the tip of my penknife, a blade worn thin from years of morse bracassai, began to carve, not deep, just enough to catch the light. Letter by letter, I etched Evans beneath the 12 o'clock marker, the metal yielding with a soft, almost mournful scrape. My hands didn't shake. They knew this was the only memorial he'd get, and so his name became part of my pulse. For 50 years, I never took that watch off. Not during the typhoons off Okinawa. Not during the long silences of demobilization. Not even when my wife begged me to wear something less heavy to her sister's wedding. The Waltham stayed on my wrist, its brass darkened by salt, sweat, and time. The name Evans, worn smooth in places, but never, illegible, never forgotten. I'd glance at it during board meetings, during my son's christening, during the bleak winter after my daughter left home, and feel not guilt, but responsibility. As long as I lived, he wasn't erased. People asked about the engraving. Family name? Teive. Sai. I'd nod, or offer a half-smile, and change the subject. The truth was too heavy for casual conversation. How do you explain that a man's sacrifice was deemed unworthy of record, that bureaucracy could murder memory as surely as a torpedo? I learned to carry it quietly, like a secret sacrament. In 1967, during a reunion of Blackwood survivors in Portsmouth, I ran into Lieutenant Price, the damage control officer who'd been on watch that night. He was gray now, stooped, but his eyes still held that wartime sharpness. Over bitter tea at the Dolphin Hotel, he leaned in and whispered, "I saw what you did. The watch." I froze, but he didn't condemn me. He placed a trembling hand on my arm and said, "Good. Someone should remember him properly." Then he handed me a small, water-stained notebook as personal log from 43, open to March 14th. It read, "Evans O. Died sealing. Fuel leak. Hero command says omit." I won't. I wept then, not for Evans, but for the sheer, stubborn decency of a man who kept truth alive in ink, while the world preferred silence. Years passed, the watch ticked. My hands grew spotted, my hair white, but Evans remained. In 1995, I donated my wartime papers to the Imperial War Museum, except the wall. The archivist, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, asked why I kept it. I told her the story. She listened without interruption, then said softly, "Would you consider letting us display it? Not as artifact, but as testament." I said no, not out of selfishness, but because monuments are for crowds. This was for him and for me. Then, in 2002, the Ministry of Defense declassified a batch of wartime personnel records under the Compassionate Disclosure Initiative. Buried in Box 47C, file Blackwood _JW53_incident, was a stamped memo from Captain Rutherford. Recommend omission of Evans, E from official tally, due to unauthorized intervention. Preserve operational clarity. Operational clarity, as if clarity mattered more than courage. I took the wool thumb to a jeweler in Bathnot, to repair it, but to reinforce the engraving. The old man peered through his loupe, traced the letters with a fingertip, and said, "This name, it's been loved." I didn't correct him. It had been mourned, honored, born but, yes, loved. In its way, last spring, on the anniversary of that night, I stood on the cliffs near Lyme Regis, where the channel meets the sky in a seam of silver. I was 8. My breath came shallow, my bones thin as driftwood. I took off the watch first time in half a century and held it to the wind. The sea below roared, unchanged, indifferent. But I spoke anyway. "They forgot you," I said, but I didn't. And that counted. I didn't to throw it. Some memories aren't meant for the deep. Now it sits in a glass case on my grandson's desk, a history teacher in Bristol. He shows it to his students when they ask, "Did ordinary people really matter in the war?" He doesn't tell them the official story. He tells them the true one. And every morning, before his first class, he checks the time, not on his phone, but on that old brass face where a name still beats like a heart.